So my formal education was in optometry. That was in school in Philadelphia. And one day, my friends and I went down into downtown Philly to a radio station. I think it was WCAU in Philadelphia. And went into the control room, looked around, and I had a very strong feeling that this is the kind of thing I wanted to do, rather than what I was studying for. What happened is that I started recording my friends who were trumpet player, clarinet player, piano player, and doing sessions in my parents' house. And that sort of grew. And then after a while, I started to hear from people in the neighborhood who wanted me to record them. So then the phone started to ring. Then that grew in that area, recording for other people. And that's how it started. This is how I met Alfred Lion of Blue Note Records. So I was forging ahead there in Hackensack, doing my demos, recording the local lady singing Ave Maria. And there was a fellow, but I think it was Gus Datiris, who wanted to record a band that he knew about, which was a tenor, he was a baritone, he is a baritone player by the name of Gil Millay. So he had a little band, and I recorded him for Gus. And Alfred heard this thing, and he liked it. He had put it out. It was a 10-inch LP. And Alfred put it out. And then apparently he liked, this was before I knew him, Alfred did. And he wanted to make another one. Time came to make another record. So at that time, Alfred was recording at New York at WOR in their studio. And he took it to the engineer and played the record for him and said, look, I want to make another record to sound like this. And the engineer said, I can't do that. You better take it to the guy who made it. And Alfred did exactly that. Came to me. This is before Prestige, too. And came to me and he said, let's make another record that sounds like this. I said, okay, no problem. When do you want to do it? So I wrote it in a book. And they came in. And that was the first time I met Alfred. And I just stayed there to the end. At least the end of that period. Well, to record Jimmy Smith at the very beginning was really difficult for me, because Jimmy was sort of an uncontrolled creature as far as the organ was concerned. And I had to devise techniques to make that sound acceptable.
Back around 1998, Hitoshi Namikanta called me, and who's been running Blue Note in Japan since 1983. And he had another great creative idea. He asked me if I would call Rudy Van Gelder to see if he would remaster, given today's technology, his original recordings. I told him, I will call Rudy, but I can tell you right now, he absolutely will say no. I called you, you thought about it for a little while, called me back and said, yes, let's do this. The reason I thought you'd say no was because if I'd ask you questions about the past, or we get into reminiscing about the past or something, you always felt very strongly about living in the present and thinking about tomorrow's recording date, not looking back at the past so much. But you were very enthusiastic about embarking on this. Why was that?
Well, when you first called me, I thought, wow, this is the best job I ever had. The idea of listening to the old tapes that I made, another chance to transfer them. Since the advent of the CD, other people had been doing that. This is my opportunity to present my version of how those things should sound. What a great job this is. All right, so to describe a day while I was practicing optometry, and that went on for 13 years, I would go to the office during the day, and then if I had something scheduled at night, I would come back and record at night. If it was Wednesday, Prestige would come in with Miles Davis, and I'd record during the day. And then, of course, there was the weekends. It was really difficult. Some days I'd have to skip the office, and some days I couldn't do sessions every day, but the pressure was there to do that. It got so busy that I had to assign each label its own day. So no matter what happened, they would come in that day. And that worked for quite a while, actually, because otherwise it was everybody, I had to balance people's schedule, musicians and so forth. So what happened, I would assign Monday, for example, to Savoy, Tuesday to Vox, Wednesday to Prestige. And Vox, I remember one time had 2 days a week. And then Alfred for Blue Note, he would get Friday. And every Saturday I got a headache. It was a period then where the music was really a little beyond what the equipment was able to deal with. And it took me a while to sort of get to reverse that position where I had a better handle on what I was doing. I had control over the way the sound should be. And I was a little bit ahead of the music, but that took a long time. So it was like a balance and back and forth thing.
So, and this sort of paralleled the shift from Hackensack to in the early years at Englewood Cliffs.
Yes. Yeah. It was just not myself, but the musicians dealing with a larger space and what they were used to and their reaction to that, some plus, some minus. But it was a different experience altogether. But none of that was really a surprise. I mean, when I built the studio, I thought, well, if it doesn't sound right, I can change it. I'll do things on the interior and so forth to change the sound, but it never happened. And I guess that was a pleasant surprise.
Yeah. But so when you heard like a buzz on an amp or something, you just relive, damn, that lousy amp you brought in, and I mean,
guitar
a lot of those challenges would come right
absolutely,
right back to.
I could absolutely, like Kenny Burrell, for example, he had a little problem always with his pickup, that when his fingers left the strings, there would be a little tick, like I said, today would be considered a digital tick if things were not in lock, you know.
Right.
But there were just like that, a very high frequency tick, and it was his fingers on this. It just wasn't properly grounded, and here I am, 40 years later or whatever it was, and here's those same ticks. I had to take them out because it didn't sound like what it really was. It was happening with his amplifier and his guitar, and I had to deal with it in the sense of the digital age. Working for Creed was another world. First of all, I liked the way he worked. He started at 10 o'clock in the morning. We could go home at 6, you know, and there was some life in addition to just the studio. And we really agreed on almost everything sonically, as far as the sound is concerned. And he was really on top of things. He knew what was happening. Not a hands-on type of person. We never spoke in dB or anything. He never said, give me 3 dB more of this or that. We didn't need to talk like that. And to this day, I don't like people who do. But we understood what the result should be. And I think I knew how to get that for him. And so it was a totally different way of approaching the music. And so the fact that we were in this larger space, there would be larger orchestras, strings, with brass and so forth, and it became a different kind of concept as to what the product would be, and it reached many more people too. Creed brought in Diodato, which was the 2001 album, George Benson, Wes Montgomery, Jimmy Smith, and absolutely one of the greatest arrangers with Don Sebesky. I really just enjoyed working with him. He produced sounds which were gratifying to me, and Bob James with the Westchester Lady for Bob James. Of course, Freddie Hubbard with the First Light. Just wonderfully productive years. Well, one of the things that used to be the bane of Alfred's existence musically, or in his record label, was that everywhere he went, Bob Weinstock would follow him. He would hire a guy, and then all of a sudden Bob Weinstock would follow. I don't know if that applied in this case, but shortly after I did this for Alfred, Bob Weinstock of Prestige Records, he's the founder of Prestige Records, came into my office while I was doing optometry. And he asked me if I would like to record for him. I said, well, sure, let's do it. So there was a period that I was recording for both Alfred Lion of Blue Note and both Bob Weinstock of Prestige. So the differences in working for the two of them were, for me, quite large. For example, if I had a new microphone I wanted to try out, Alfred was the sort of person who was very much organized. He knew what he wanted. I believe he knew what the finished product was going to be while he was doing the sessions. It was pretty intense working for him because he knew what he wanted, and I had to deliver what he wanted, and that's what I was doing. On the other hand, the Prestige sessions were a lot looser. There was not the musicians were a little freer. There wasn't a lot of preparation. They sort of decided things as they went along. So I would always experiment with the technical stuff with Prestige, make sure I understood it, make sure I knew what it did, make sure I knew how it worked, and then I would use that for Blue Note.
When you look through jazz discographies, there aren't a whole lot of live albums until Alfred starts recording, like Blakey at Birdland and Jimmy Smith up at Smalls, and it wasn't a common experience then.
Alfred Lion had a deep belief that good things happen after dark, and musically at least. And for a night at the Vanguard, any individual night or any remote, it took me 3 days to prepare for it.
Really?
The day before, take down the studio, take all the equipment, load it into the car, deliver to go to the day of the session, to set up in the afternoon, not at night, full day for that. And then after the session, we go home, then what?
Break down and rebuild.
Rebuild and put it back up on the studio. That's 3 full days' work just to do one day. It was a ratio of 3 to 1.
You should have charged more.
Now you tell me. When I was a kid first doing this, I used to go to Newark and record the musicians in the back of a bar someplace in Newark.
Really?
And one night I went over there. I actually hired a bodyguard, some ex-policeman or something, to go with me to go to Newark and go through this process just to record. I forget who it was, and I'd forgotten the tape. How did I record without the tape? Why don't you ask me that?
How did you record without the tape?
I went back to Hackensack and picked up the tape. during the time I was in Hackensack recording, for example, classical music, I would be going to various places like Symphony Hall in Boston, and I get a feeling of being in a place like that, the way it sounds, without any people in it. It affected the kind of sound I wanted for my own place. I did go to some sessions at 30th Street, the Columbia Studio in Manhattan, and of course, that really was a strong influence as to the actual structure of the studio, not the control room, but the structure of the room where the performer would be. That influenced me very strongly, I must admit that. I would say that's probably the only thing, as far as the studio structure, that really influenced me would be 30th Street, and plus the few concert halls I had been in. I just liked the way it sounds.
One of the things that I remember you were initially not in love with was tackling recordings made by other people, because in the course of Blue Note's history, there were recordings made in Europe, or sometimes recordings made at Audio Video if Van Gelders was booked. And I understood the resistance to taking on someone else's problems. It's one thing to deal with your own work, but at one time, I thought it was time to revisit all of the early 12-inch albums. And most of those were made up of sessions that Alfred Lion had done for Blue Note at WOR in the late 40s. You know, a very important early Bud Powell, early Milt Jackson, early Thelonious Monk, etc. And so we brought all the 16-inch acetates across the country to the studio, and I knew it was going to be a lot of work in a lot of ways, but when the final result came, it was better than anything I had hoped for. I just wondered if you'd talk about that time and that process.
Well, I had enough problems dealing with my own problems, you know, and that was a very time-consuming, difficult process. On top of that, I have found from experience that if I deal with other people's work, there are problems on top of problems, of which I had no control, and I would never have done it that way, with one exception, maybe two exceptions. And in a broad sense, the recording before tape that was made on acetate discs, 16-inch transcriptions, that was something I really felt I understood, and the process was so difficult that amateurs didn't do it. They had professionals doing that, and let me give my version of those. The other thing was more recently, The Birth of the Cool. That was just a beautiful original recording, and I really wanted a chance to master that. I felt that no one had really heard it right. So it covers a big span of time, but very few. The acetates of the ancient history and The Birth of the Cool in the fairly recent history. So one of the sessions I did was for Prestige, and it was with Monk and with Miles. And Miles, during Miles' solo, this is when they were talking it through before we recorded, Miles said to Monk, "Lay out behind my solo." So, okay, I just overheard that. And okay, now we come to the take, we start recording. And when it came to Miles' solo, Monk stood up, and he was, very tall and Miles, the way he played at that, with his mute sort of crunched, pinto looking down at the floor. So he had Monk towering over him, standing over while he was playing. So later, Miles said, "Well, why did you do that?" And he says, "Well, Monk said, "Well, I don't have to sit down to lay out." after the sessions are over and all the musicians have gone home, then what? Well, you take the tapes and you transfer them into a machine like this. This is called a Scully, built by Larry Scully in Bridgeport, Connecticut. And this is the machine that I used to make the masters for all the LPs of that era. I would take a blank, what we used to call a lacquer disc, put it on the lathe, like that. And then there was a suction device which you would attach here. And through holes in the turntable, it would create a vacuum which would hold the disc nice and flat onto the surface of the precision turntable. And then you put the cutter head right here over the beginning of the disc, engage the rest of the mechanism, and press the start button. You would end up with the sound transferred to the cutter head, which would then move the cutting stylus and then engrave it into the surface of this lacquer disc. And it would end up somewhere about here, which would be the inside diameter of a 12-inch LP. After that was through, then it's the master. Take that out and send it out to the plant for coating and then making pressings and then replicating the discs in plastic. And that's the way it was done in the age of mechanics. The mastering series has enabled me to get closer to the music of many musicians who played here and in Hackensack, much more so than I ever could before. People like Hank Mobley, people like Lee Morgan, who I wish I could record him again. I could do a much better job. People like that, I got much closer to their music than I ever did just by talking to them at the session. I had a different responsibility at that time. I was in another world. I was not listening to the music. I wouldn't even, like when these Coltrane sessions that are so complex and dense, I wasn't in, that didn't bother me. That was not the question. I was trying to make these individual people be heard in the way they wanted to be heard. That's what I was doing on the date. Now, we're listening years later, that's a different experience for me.
I remember when we first started this project, I'd occasionally get a call from you on a Saturday, and you say, wow, you know, Hank Mobley roll call, this is an incredible record, or Tina Brooks is an amazing tenor player. And suddenly it sounded like a fan who was like hearing the music for the first time. And it dawned on me, in some ways probably you were hearing it for the first time.
I was, sure. Even though I was at the original session, I had other things to deal with. I never really could listen to the music in detail as a whole, as a listener would from a distance. I was involved in the moment, the technical problems, whether the microphones were working right, other things that were going on in the room, and the limitations of what I was dealing with. I really had a struggle to record that almost every session. And now all that is over with. Here's the way the music sounded, and it was like a first-time experience for me. And not just on one album, on a whole bunch of albums. So it was great fun.